Hello and welcome to this RSA session, Hooked by the Phisherman, Quarterbacking Breach Response with Law Enforcement. My name is Marc Sangster, cybersecurity author and industry security strategist with eSentire. And joining me today is a distinguished panel of experts. I will let them quickly introduce themselves, starting on my virtual left with Justin.
Good afternoon. My name is Justin Daniels. I am an attorney at Baker Donelson. I help quarterback companies creating cybersecurity hygiene and also what we're going to talk about today, which is quarterbacking incident response.
Good afternoon. My name is Marc Debrody, and I'm a supervisory special agent with the United States Secret Service based here in our Atlanta office. I oversee our cyber fraud task force, which consists of members from private industry, law enforcement, and academia. I'm also privileged to be able to supervise a group of talented men and women in our digital evidence and forensics lab who respond to cyber-related crimes in the Atlanta area. Looking forward to the conversation and some of the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jodi Daniels, and my company, Red Clover Advisors, is a privacy consultancy. So we help companies comply with global privacy laws like GDPR, CCPA, and the myriad of other privacy laws. And we serve as the fractional privacy officer to many small and mid-sized companies. Glad to be here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Lyle. I am the head of claims at Coalition. We are a cyber insurance carrier that works with entities like Baker Donelson, with the U.S. Secret Service, with Red Clover, to help entities recover from cyber events.
Terrific. And thanks everyone for joining us today and sharing your expertise and your insights. Just before we begin, I would just like to remind everyone who is attending that you can enter any questions you have in the chat window, and we make sure that we do cover them during the session. And that also for those of you seeking CLE credit, the code will appear in the chat box towards the end of the presentation. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So I'm just going to set the scenario for you that we face. And this comes from a combination of real world events that we've all had to work with. So in this case, the phishing scam is a student from a prestigious business school approaches a senior executive looking for a mentor. And of course, after several weeks, the executive then receives a document to a link for a survey to effectively make sure that the student can get their academic credit and completion for their course. Of course, they click on the link, their Office 365 login window appears and they log in. It appears to conform with the company's policies and standards and branding. And once logged in, they complete what looks like a legitimate survey. Days later, however, the company receives an alert about suspicious activity on the network. When employees come in to work the following morning, they turn on their computers, they all see the following message with the contact email address. And effectively, it's a ransomware message that now says that every system, all the files and data in their environment has been locked, could be destroyed, and they have to pay the equivalent of $5 million in Bitcoin to receive the decryption key. As you can imagine, this is a pretty bad start to your day. So Justin, when this sort of thing happens, where do we start?
Well, usually we start when I get the call on a Saturday or Sunday, because of course the threat actor wants to wait for the weekend. And so what goes through my mind is a variety of things. One, many times a company doesn't even have an incident response plan. So it means I got to put together the team. It also means, what am I thinking about in terms of what are we going to communicate to customers and employees who are going to show up on Monday and expect service and it's not happening? What do we do with potentially having a ransom negotiation, because we don't know yet if we can get our systems back? Do we have good backups? Have they already exfiltrated data? And as part of that, we're going to have to do a forensic report. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, we're going to have to engage with law enforcement and get them involved in the process. And that's the topic we're going to talk about today. And the art of incident response is, how do you figure out which one of these factors is the most important at any time during the incident response? And it changes like the weather hourly.
So Justin, is there an anecdote you can share on, you deal with these events on a regular basis. Is there, an example of this kind of ransomware attack that you've had to handle?
Oh, I've got several. So I've dealt with 3 different ones in the last 4 months, one of which is a national logistics carrier. And I got the call on a Sunday and their entire network was down and they're like, what do we do? So I had to be like the indie pit crew team and put together the forensic response, the PR crisis comms, as well as dealing with law enforcement, and that had to be done within 24 to 48 hours. And that includes putting people under the proper engagement letters to preserve attorney-client privilege. There's just so many different things that you're thinking about in these different events that you have to do right off the bat before you can start working the problem. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a big deal to have an incident response plan, because that first 24 hours without it, I'm just putting together the team. I'm not even working the problem yet. And I've seen that happen again and again because companies just don't have a plan.
Yeah, and of course, one of the issues, and I think things that we talked about in preparation for this, was that you have to kind of gauge the security acumen of the firm, the executives and the people you're dealing with, right? And I mean, what are some of the challenges you see there with working with non-technical leaders, as an example, and trying to broker communication and collaboration between the sort of the technical ones and zeros and the dollar signs and cents of the C-suite?
I would say, again, from my perspective, I play the role of kind of the interpreter. I'm going to spend time later this year taking a class in network infrastructure because it is so critically important, because the C-suite speaks one language, the IT department speaks a very different language, and you put all of these people under time pressure with limited facts and expect them to make good business decisions. You can imagine how difficult that is, especially if I've had cases where the media is sniffing around because the company's been big enough and they've been in the news for other reasons. So you put all of those ingredients into a bowl, and you can imagine how challenging that can be and how important good communication is. And you've got people who've never worked together before who speak different business languages, and you have to meld them together and get the information you need to make the best business decision, which many times can be what is the least bad decision.
If I could add to what Justin just mentioned regarding the plan, as far as the law enforcement piece there, we're not just reactive in the law enforcement community, we're proactive as well. And we love to be a part of those conversations before, the proverbial hair's on fire and you're responding to the ransomware incident. Some things we do, for example, on the proactive side are actually cyber education, cyber hygiene for employees and the C-suite as well. We also are really excited about participating in tabletop exercises. I've done several with Justin, both at large scale with city municipalities, and even on a smaller scale with the C-suite executives. And it's really helpful to kind of run through that conversation in a calmer environment where people can think through the challenges without having the pressure of their computers being locked up. So law enforcement would love to get invited to those conversations, and we certainly want to establish those relationships well before the crisis happens.
And to that point, right, knowing that you can reach out to law enforcement, to Marc and his team, all comes from that preparation portion that Justin was just talking about, right? Making sure you have your incident response plan in place ahead of time so that you all know how to communicate, you know who to communicate with. One of those entities being law enforcement, another entity being your insurance company. Knowing that law enforcement isn't going to rat you out, right? They're not going to, their interest is not to go tell someone higher up. Their interest is to help solve the problem. And if you already are comfortable with that, because you've already talked about it with Justin and his team, because you know that, hey, if we have a ransomware event, we want to get them involved ahead of time. Hey, if we have a ransomware event, we're going to call insurance first. And also, hey, if we have an event, we know what type of insurance we have. These are all arising from what Justin just talked about, because not all insurance is created equal. You need to know what types of coverage exist. You need to know where and how they get implicated. You need to know that, don't be defeatist about it. Don't think, oh, well, it's not going to be covered, so I'm not going to do anything about it, because it may be covered, or it may be only covered when you have asked for authorization. But those are all things that you've talked about during either your tabletop, because you've realized, wait, we have insurance, we would call our insurance company, or you have an incident response team.
I'd like to echo the tabletop part, Catherine, that you just talked about. I think it's so important for companies to make sure that they go through a simulation. Sometimes maybe this event happened and the team you thought would be available, maybe one of them is on vacation or unavailable. So who's going to be the pecking order of, next in line? And then it might seem like a simple idea, but do print the actual contact list, because if it's on that network and then you can't actually get to the network, it's going to be very challenging to try and remember who everyone was.
Absolutely. And where the information is kept, right? So to Jodi's point, or Jodi, with the work that you do, what systems we have, what types of information we keep, all of those types of things, so that if it's there, it's printed out, you've run through those things, on that server, we don't keep employee data. However, we also do keep the keys to the kingdom. So you just need to be able to have hashed that out ahead of time.
Catherine, I appreciate you saying law enforcement won't rat folks out. Thank you. I did not pay her to say that, but it's very true. And it's one of the obstacles actually as to why people don't call us. I mean, I have people say all the time, well, we're afraid you're going to go public with it, or, you're going to report to OFAC, or you're going to, and none of that is true. And we won't do those things, certainly without consulting with you, with the victim. We're not there to re-victimize the victim. We're the government. We're here to help, right? But we're focused on attribution and disruption. That's kind of law enforcement's main goal, right? So we're not there to repunish. And a couple of other points I want to just kind of highlight, since we're on the subject, is that, we have a tremendous amount of experience with multiple variants of ransomware. And because of that experience, we're able to really identify kind of the trends and ways these different variants, not only the vector into the network but how they propagate across the network and how they may escalate privileges and that type of thing. So that's helpful when companies are trying to determine at the initial set of what the severity and risk is at the time. And so we can provide some of those background pieces, indicators of compromise, perhaps. In rare occasions, we're also able to provide decryptor keys, but that's more the exception than the rule. And so, inviting us in, we're just a piece of that team that may be able to actually help you. And if you're talking about a business email compromise, which I know is not the focus right here, but that involves money in a real sense. And if money is gone, we certainly can help with tracing that and bringing that back. And we've actually helped some of Justin's clients with that. So call us, invite us in, and we're here to help.
But to your point on FTF, the funds transfer fraud that arises from a BEC, law enforcement is fantastic because you're able to go and knock on the virtual door of the bank and say, hey, we're going to freeze this account. We're going to either seize the money, which I know people associate seizure as being bad. Seizure is good with FTF, with funds transfer fraud, because that means it's being held by the safety of the government. And we've had cases where working with, law enforcement, they say, hey, just file the paperwork. We're going to return the money to you. And it's worked. And we've reached out many times to the FBI, Secret Service, to get that assistance, to get those larger sums and save those money, save that money and return it. Because we don't want to further fund this kind of criminal action.
And we will take those calls that Catherine mentioned anytime, but ideally we'd like those calls if they're involving transfers of funds to be within 72 hours. And that's kind of a rule, especially when it goes overseas. A lot of these things make multiple hops once the fraud happens. So when they go overseas, we have to initiate what we call a kill chain letter request, and that has a 72-hour requirement. And after that, it's very difficult. So early is better. And notifying, and the earlier you notify us in those situations, the higher the probability that we'll be able to actually be successful in recovering some funds.
It's funny you say that, Marc, because I had a client who subject to wire fraud, and they called me about 20 minutes after it happened, and I was on the phone with the Secret Service within 5, and we got almost all our money back because, as I like to say, when the Secret Service calls the bank, they don't get put on hold. They don't have to dial 3 times. They just get put right through. And that's one of the real advantages of dealing with law enforcement. But I want to add one other thing is in a couple of the events that I handled, I had a specific strain of ransomware, and I was able to talk to law enforcement, and they were able to help us quickly identify what were the indicators of compromise. So we knew very quickly what we were dealing with because, as Marc said, law enforcement, I mean, we were case number 67, according to the law enforcement agent, and he had their whole repertoire. And it was so helpful to have that because it helped put us in the right frame set, and we knew exactly where to go and what we were dealing with. Why? Because we reached out to law enforcement up front. We weren't afraid. I knew exactly what they could do and not do. And to echo Marc Debrody, I work with them often, and I've had nothing but really good experiences with professionals who, as Marc said, they just want to figure out who did it, have attribution, and try to help you navigate all of that.
And part of that is the mitigation, right? So Marc, we've talked about like this mitigation, but also OFAC has been pretty clear that if you work with law enforcement during the course of your ransomware, you'll get that extra value, right? That you'll be seen as cooperating. So if you end up, down the pike, right? We've seen all these new variants that I think are going to be in the eye of the government and possibly hitting OFAC. Maybe they'll look kindly upon you that you involved law enforcement. And they've said so much in some of their alerts.
Catherine, can we just level set for a minute there? Because I know we were going to talk about it in greater detail in a little bit, but can you just tell us about Treasury's, the two bulletins or alerts that they put out towards the end of last year and what they mean and what you're referring to when you talk about the OFAC list? I know most people do, but just to make sure everyone understands.
Sure. And everybody else, chime in where I have gaps. So Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC. It is, the naughty list. It is the sanction list. It is the list that the U.S. government Treasury keeps and says that you cannot pay any individual, any company, any country on this list because they are, for sanctioned, deemed the bad guys. That list, though, has strict liability. So if you pay someone that is not on the list and they are later put on the list, Treasury can come back and say, you're liable, even though at the time they were not on the list. Now, this includes, right, any entity working that's associated with, let's use Iran, with Russia right now. These are sanctioned, right? These are on the sanction list, so we cannot pay them. If in the future, as we have seen in the news, we've had ransomware very much in the news. If in the future we find that variants end up on that list, we will not be able to pay for a variant. But if on the day that we pay, they're not on the list, right? By working with law enforcement and showing OFAC in the future, if they were to come back and say, hey, you paid, there's protection there.
And Justin, when Catherine talks about liability here, are we talking about regulatory fines and settlements, or are we talking about criminal prosecution potentially?
Oh no, Lieutenant Caffey. We have behind door number one for you, criminal prosecution for money laundering. What I would add is, and I love this language that's in the OFAC ruling, if you work with law enforcement, it is a substantial mitigating effect. Exactly what that means, I don't know, but it basically codifies that if you're involved in a ransomware engagement, you best be picking up the phone to engage with law enforcement, because if any of the other things that Catherine is talking about were to happen, you want to be able to say, yes, I did engage with law enforcement. We worked with them from the outset because the government wants to incentivize this cooperation and collaboration. Because as we'll probably talk about later, is in light of just this year with ransomware and last year, we have to really overhaul how we are working together as the private sector, public sector, and law enforcement on how we deal with this stuff proactively. And I think that OFAC advisory was part of that underlying policy.
And if I could just add to Justin and Catherine's comments, I want to clarify the Secret Service and federal law enforcement as a whole, we're not regulators, right? Just want to emphasize that point. And in fact, we're not even notifying regulators or OFAC unless the victim actually requests that we do so. And of course, we would report that it's timely and cooperating, and if in fact that happened. I mean, a simple phone call saying that we have a ransomware and hanging up is not kind of full timely. And somebody DM'd me. Gosh, I sound like my 12-year-old when I said that, but I apologize. Somebody DM'd me and said, "Who do we call?" They were asking, "Do we call Secret Service, FBI, IC3?" So that's a very good question, and the answer is call someone, and call someone who has a relationship that you have a relationship with. We're going to throw up on the screen eventually. Marc Sangster will do that, showing our website with the Secret Service, where we have the list of the 40 plus task forces across the country and actually globally that and the address, the phone numbers, and the contacts of those locations. So you can actually reach out again proactively and have a conversation before the crisis happens, and you can connect with someone. FBI, Secret Service, there's plenty of crime to go around. I work tremendously well. We all work tremendously well with our federal partners here in Atlanta and elsewhere. And don't worry about, is this FBI jurisdiction or Secret Service? We will deconflict that in the background. So if you happen to call the wrong agency, it may be FBI or Secret Service, we'll deconflict that. So you don't have to worry about that. And we just want to make certain that the most important thing is that you make the call. So thanks for that question.
But that goes back to the preparation, right? Because call Coalition, call your insurance carrier, call Justin, right? Say, hey, do you have a contact here? Yes, let me put you in touch with them. Let's use all the services that you can have at your beck and call. Go do the tabletop. All of that is so essential. It's just as essential as knowing where your data is. It's just as essential as all those other elements.
And part of building that relationship is you'll have the ability to hear a little bit about the types of ransomware that's out there. What are some of the risks that you should be mindful of and understand? So, Marc, to your point where I can't just call you and hang up, I did my job, I called you. I really need to be able to build a relationship and involve you. And so as part of that preparation, it's really having the opportunity to have them come to the company, participate in the tabletop, and hear what's kind of on the street. What do I need to be mindful of? What's happening with other companies? And to Justin, your point about the collaboration between public and private, the more companies that engage law enforcement, the better off all companies will be, because we're all then going to have more information to be able to protect and hopefully continue to try and win.
So, Marc, when we're talking about communication, what about in the preparation side? So you talked about, tabletops and, executive awareness training, but are those aspects that you would help a company with as well when it comes to, internal communication, client communication, and so on to any affected parties?
Yeah, we do a lot of education to employees across, pre-COVID, we were doing it in person. Here, we do it across our task forces across the country. We're doing a lot of virtual stuff. We do targeted presentations towards C-suite executives that focus on business email compromise or ransomware. But one of the questions we get is, if we do call you, what do we need to provide? Like what are you going to ask of us? Are you going to ask for the entire kitchen sink? Or what are you asking for? And so what I often say to folks is, hopefully you've had that conversation internally before we do call. Ask the questions, what can we provide? The insurance, whoever's in the mix here, in a law enforcement case, you want to be able to answer that question with your legal counsel and everybody else before it happens. When we do call, we're going to be asking for things like network logs or IP addresses. If it's a business email compromise, email headers. Did you download the malware? Can we get a copy or samples? Did you pay the ransom? I mean, it's not something that we endorse, but we know it's a business decision. If you do, can we get information from the wallet? Because there's certainly a follow the money kind of angle to this as well. So those are some of the things we're looking for, indicators of compromise when we do respond.
I mean, I would add to what Marc is saying about the relationship with law enforcement is I brought Marc into a tabletop I did for a municipality, and I hadn't done one for a public entity before. And when we did it, one of the key things we took away is when a private company decides to make a ransom payment, they get to do that in the privacy of a boardroom. For municipalities, they might have to have a city council meeting, which can be streamed, and the threat actor can be listening in, and it's like, oh, you guys are agreeing you're going to pay $1 million. That's very good information to know. And so one of the key takeaways from that particular tabletop was, do we have a budgetary line item that already has that included? Of course, not called ransomware payment. Or are there special powers that are in the city's charter that we have to research and review, so that if we are in that situation, we can then engage those special powers to go behind closed doors or otherwise not do it in public? But part of the real value of that whole exercise is now the municipality knows exactly the types of information the Secret Service or law enforcement would ask. And so we know going into it, and we save time, and we know exactly what to give them. Because what people don't realize until you're in a ransomware event, the most important thing is, how do you spend your time? And the more that you know up front what to expect, the more efficient and effective you can be with your time.
Look, to that point of time, right? Marc was just talking about, oh, are you going to ask me for all of this information? A lot of the information they're already asking for is part of information that you would need to know, because you have a series of privacy obligations to meet. And Jodi knows this all too well, like knowing where your data is, et cetera. So, knowing that information, you're not being tasked of anything different, right, Jodi? This is something you should be knowing ahead of time.
Absolutely. The data inventory, as I like to say, is the foundation of a privacy program. Thank you for the drum roll, Justin. It's critical to be able to understand what data elements you have. Where are they? Are they on your databases? Are they on servers? Are they in vendors, third-party vendors? What states are they in? What customers are involved? Are they employees? You really need to be able to break down to that granular level where all that data is. And as Justin, you always like to say, if you have a ransomware event, you need to be able to understand, that data on that server, it's encrypted. You might not be able to go check it out. But if you had a data inventory, you'd be able to understand, right, well, that includes the corporate information, but this one over here is the employee information, and that one over there is the most sensitive customer information. So you'd be better armed. And then with that is also going to help you understand what your data breach obligations may or may not be, as well as any other privacy law obligations. So each state has their own data breach law, as well as if you're an international company, you have international laws to consider. And then depending on the industry you're in, you might also have industry-specific data breach obligations. So best to start, once you have your incident response, which is the starting point, then you need the data inventory. And from there, you can start to begin some of your other obligations that you and Justin would proceed with.
It's funny you mentioned that, because from my perspective, and I can't emphasize this point enough, is the most important point in any ransomware engagement is when you might have a legal obligation or otherwise need to start discussing the ransomware event with other people. And it could be publicly, it could be with your customers, or if you've gotten the exfiltration or access to personal information that triggers notification under the state laws, that's when your rogues gallery of plaintiffs can get very large. And that's when you, at that point, likely have some pretty significant litigation and legal liability risk with the engagement. And it's made much more difficult if you don't even know what data you have. Because once I get in and it's all encrypted, to Jodi's point, if you don't have a good data inventory, then we're guessing where it is, and multiply that problem even worse, because with the remote workforce, I've had multiple instances of seeing on a ransomware event where people downloaded sensitive company data or personal information to their personal computer. And that makes it an even trickier problem.
Yeah, of course. BYOD is now BYOH, right? Bring your office home. Actually, we just had a question come in around this point, which is, if you're in a scenario where a third-party company, so a vendor, has been compromised with ransomware and there is a material impact, what as their client should we be doing to require that they disclose this to us as the customer? And sort of the second part of that is, could they actually pay or report to a regulator and never notify us as the client?
So I handled that exact situation a couple months ago. So I represented a medical IT company, and their hosting vendor got hit. And the result of the hosting vendor getting hit with ransomware was our customers' data was implicated. And they ended up paying the ransom. But the challenge that we had was that company was not forthcoming with information. So we had a situation that impacted our customer where we didn't really know what was going on because the vendor was hunkering down, and I didn't have anything in my contract with them that required that if they had a data breach that they had to disclose and cooperate. To make my situation even more difficult was my client's liability to our customer was 10x what it was to the vendor because they had a blanket $25,000 limitation of liability clause. So to me, the answer there is you really need to care what is in your contract, because it will likely be your contract that governs what is the vendor required to disclose to you if they have a data breach. And then on top of that, you need to make sure that their liability is at least equal to what your potential liability is to your customer, because we provide so many integrated services these days where we are relying on third-party vendors to be part of our service. And the unintended consequence of that is the situation that the attendees question presented, and that's exactly what I dealt with.
And it's because the client is responsible, right? They own that data.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, they're the ones that are going to be held responsible. And the vendor, you may try to third-party suit them later, but if they have 70, 100, 1,000 other third-party, claims coming in, the likelihood of there being enough money for them, very limited.
And what makes that situation even more interesting, because we're talking about healthcare, so we're talking HIPAA, is even though my client isn't going to be the focus of the investigation because we didn't have the breach, if our customer who owns the data has to notify, now we bring into the class action. To Catherine's point, that's where my client gets third-partied in, and they're like, well, it wasn't our problem, it was this vendor. And I'm like, but our contract with them limits our liability in a way that our liability is not limited to our customer. And I think our customers looking at us say, hey, I don't care that your vendor had a problem. You're the person I contracted with, and you're the one I expect to be responsible.
In practicality, we're seeing this kind of manifest itself in the field in cases in our area where we have third parties, MSSPs, for example, that are actually the primary targets of the ransomware. And it's disseminated across their client base. And we've had situations here where we've had doctors' offices, small, medium-sized businesses come in one Monday morning, turn on their computers, and bam, they're frozen. But they have no desire, the bad actors have actually no desire to negotiate with the individual client. They want to go to the MSSP or whoever the third party is. So it's very real. And it's a disturbing trend, actually.
Well, as we've seen, they'll also go to that third party, though, and tell them, hey, this is the threat actor. Want to let you know your MSP's been held ransom. They're not paying. You might want to encourage them to pay.
Right.
So it's even gotten worse.
Right.
So here's a wildcard question around payment of ransom. What happens if that company is an international company, so outside of the US as an example, or they pay the ransom from another company or another country? So, in terms of insurance, OFAC, law enforcement, liability, maybe Justin, we could start with you and everybody can give their opinion.
That's an interesting question, because once we're going across international to different countries, I think we're into how the Secret Service might liaison with Interpol and other international law enforcement. And then the other issue will become what other laws in that country might be implicated, because as Jodi alluded to, Europe views privacy and security very differently. GDPR is the most restrictive law in the world regarding privacy, and you have to notify within 72 hours. So paying that ransom, there are a variety of different implications, because you can get, your fine can be up to, what is it, Jodi, 4% of global revenue. So that's not cheap if you're a pretty sizable company. So as I look at that particular situation, when you start going international, you have to unpack a variety of law enforcement issues internationally, as well as navigating GDPR. And laws like in Germany, for example. They have very restrictive laws around privacy and security because European history and how they view privacy culturally is very different than the United States. And we sometimes don't appreciate that unless you are over there doing business and understanding how they view the world. It's just very different than us.
And just to clarify, the Secret Service, we're not going to provide sanctions related guidance to victims. That's going to be something that the victims are going to need to go directly to OFAC for and to discover whether or not there's that nexus. We're not going to be making that bridge for you. That's something you'll have to do direct. I can clarify that.
If it is an OFAC payment, right? So say it's a payment that the company is based out of the United States, even though that, it might be their subsidiary out of another country. Now you have to worry about whether or not you can pay the ransom out of that country and for the United States. So you still need to comply with OFAC. But going back to what Jodi said, you have to make sure now you're complying with all the states of the United States, plus the GDPR, plus any other countries that have their own privacy. So these things tack on, right? And that's where insurance can help you, because we deal with this regularly. This is something that sadly we're dealing with a daily basis. While this client may have only dealt with it, this be their first time. We connect them with the law firms, both in the United States and in Europe, in Asia, wherever the event has occurred. We work with the law enforcement in all of the different, global geo sites, right? These different locations. We are able to help them make those kind of payments and do that advisory, because we've been doing this for a while, right? So we know how to make this work, and the counsel knows how to make this work, and the forensics firm know how to make it work.
So recently, the ABA published Formal Opinion 498 around virtual law practices. And I know that's specific, obviously, to lawyers and law firms. But one of the pillars in that was the obligation to review contracts with hardware and software and application vendors to determine how well they were handling confidentiality and privacy issues. And I think that's easier said than done. And Jodi, I'd really like you to start off and weigh in on this one, because that gets real complicated real fast. Like, you use Office 365. Well, I think in everyone's mind, we say, I'm sitting in, Atlanta, so I'm probably based on some server farm in the US. Well, A, that's not true. It may actually be backed up in Ireland, in the EU. And worse than that, often these types of services, so Amazon, Microsoft, Cisco, Apple, all of them use what's called fragmentation. So your data is actually torn apart and scattered. It may be in like 20 or 30 countries. So, realistically, how can you manage that?
Well, it's certainly going to be something where you need a team to make sure that you're reviewing all the different parts. You're going to have your privacy and understanding the data. Catherine, as you've been talking about, really understanding right where your data is and what type you have, and then understanding a little bit further the types of services. So as you just mentioned, if I have Microsoft 365, having a counterpart in that company, understanding what the agreement's going to say. Many of these have kind of their data protection addendums. And this is a common question between cross-border movements, especially under GDPR between the US and the EU. So many of these types of technology services will outline, here's where this type of data is. So Marc, Sangster, as you had mentioned around fragmentation, you'll be able to, in many cases, either talk to or utilize their websites to help you navigate and understand, well, the type of data you have is going to be in this country, this type of data is going to be over here in that country. But you really need to do your due diligence, at least when you first sign on with them, and then on some type of ongoing regular cadence to continue that review, and especially in the contract review. And it often is going to show up in a data protection addendum.
Right.
I guess what I would add to what Jodi's saying from my perspective, so let's talk about some of the professions. Certain state bars, New York is one of them. Part of lawyer ethics is maintaining confidentiality. And part of that now for certain states is that you have good cybersecurity, because if they're able to hack into the law firm, we are a treasure trove of all kinds of confidential information. I remember last year, a law firm was ransomwared and they started leaking Lady Gaga's personal contracts on the dark web. The accounting profession, similar thing. And kind of what I talked about before is, what it says in your contracts around liability and insurance. I've had to explain to general counsels that, hey, if you include cybersecurity or data breach in your indemnity clause, you could invalidate your insurance because certain insurance contracts will say this, you cannot indemnify blanket. Certain things for data breaches have to be excluded. And you have so many people who just rely on the legal boilerplate and don't understand how cyber risk and privacy risk permeate that contract. And they only find out when they get into a breach and realize, you mean my liability to my customer is 10x and the vendor's liability to me is $10,000? Repeatedly, I've seen that. So when you're looking at these contracts, I can't overemphasize enough. Understand what you're signing, understand the privacy and cyber risks that you're taking, and how to have it in the contract that says if your vendor has a data breach, they're required to tell you and they're required to cooperate with you. Because if you don't, I assure you, they won't.
I will just add, I think that's why it's so important to have a team be a part of this. You need someone on the legal side who's going to be able to really review that contract and dissect much of what you've just talked about. You need someone on the business or IT side who's really going to understand the type of data that's involved, and someone also from, the privacy side and compliance side to understand the obligations. Collectively, that team will be in a much better position than maybe just one of those people reviewing it.
So Jodi, what's it like if you're in a position where you have to report to or notify a regulator? Like, what kind of information are they looking for? I mean, Marc Debrody earlier gave us examples of the sort of the forensics type of telemetry that he's looking for. But from a privacy perspective or a regulatory perspective, what should you be prepared to report and hand over?
Well, it's going to be really similar to some of what we've already been talking about, which is what type of event it was, and also the volume. So how many people were impacted. So you're going to need to know, again, kind of going back to the data. I feel like a broken record over here, but know your data, know your data, know your data. And so if you leave here, understand that you should just know your data. But truly, how many people were involved? Was it 50, 5,000, 10,000, 1 million? And it's important to really make sure that you have, now, Justin, you always talk about it's hard to know all those facts in the beginning. And some of these obligations require you to report in potentially 72 hours. You don't always have all the facts in 72 hours. So you need to be mindful and really work through the communications appropriately, but they're going to want to know the type of data, the type of incident that it might have been, the volume as well. And then again, kind of the type of data, like, is it name, is it sensitive data, to be able to trigger those obligations and what you're going to do about protecting in the future.
So this is pretty complicated, and we've talked about having teams and a lot of resources, but what do small to medium-sized firms do? Like, how can you help? Marc, how can you help? And same thing, Catherine, like, not everybody has that sort of the amount of resources that we'd see with, say, a large bank.
Sure. Well, I'll start with that one. Maybe we can go round robin. So, for we help a lot of small and mid-sized companies. I think kind of the concept of the fractional team really works well for a small organization. And whether you're small or big shouldn't change the types of relationships you have. It just might be someone's on the outside who needs to get to know your business really well and who's familiar with the organization and the privacy obligations. So we'll work with, whether it's inside or outside counsel, making sure that they've gone through a tabletop exercise or having an incident plan and knowing who their insurance carrier is. I spoke with a company yesterday, they're 50 employees. And they've done an incident response plan. They know who their insurance carrier is. They have someone on the phone roster for law enforcement. And many of their parties are all external, but they've gone through the process to make sure that they're familiar with who and what to do.
And from that insurance part, right, we can put them in touch with, because we have these contacts. We have our forensic panel, our counsel panel, our PR panel, all of those elements. So the key, just as Jodi was saying, is make sure you know who your insurance carrier is. We receive phone calls many times where someone says, I didn't even know we had insurance. The person before me, retained and got insurance. I don't even know what our policy covers. So having that available so that you know how to get in touch with your insurance carrier, doing that ahead of time. If you are saying, hey, we have a law firm that we use that specializes in privacy, in breach response, let your carrier know, let Coalition know. We can endorse them so that when they are on your policy, you can go to them immediately and they will notify us as well. But notifying us then lets you have access to our rates, our forensic firms. We're able to walk you through what I call the happy path, right? Which is the path to right the ship, because your ship has, gone off kilter here, and we need to right it. And we do that through all of these resources, these contacts, reaching out to, law enforcement, helping you recover funds, identify, do you need to pay? Don't you need to pay? How do you decide on those two things? Well, you go both paths, right? You entertain the threat actor on the right-hand side of, oh, we'd like to know, while you're looking to see if your backups are viable, while you're looking to see if you can get all of this information together. And I know that everyone thinks that insurance companies will just pay out and that's all they do. But in the cyberspace, we're very, very specific, and we actually help kind of navigate and right that ship.
So I guess I'd like to talk about what I'm going to now call the on-ramp to the happy path. And what I mean by that is I think insurance is an important tool, but it is not a panacea for having good cyber hygiene. But when we talk about insurance, you really have to understand what you're buying, because there is no uniform type of policy. And what I mean by that is, how many of you have looked at your insurance policy to see whether employee personal devices is included in the definition of computer network or it isn't? Because if you have some type of incident that emanates from a personal device, that may not be covered under your insurance. And I've had to have plenty of conversations where I had to explain to the client when they thought they had $2 million worth of business email compromise. And I'm like, no, when I read the policy, it's really $100,000. And the broker's on the phone. As you can imagine, the phone got quiet pretty quickly. And so what I'm saying is, you really have to be smart and understand what risks your business has from a cybersecurity perspective, so that when you buy insurance, you understand that you're tailoring it to your risk, so that when you try to engage with Coalition or your insurer, that you have the right type of insurance for the type of risk that you have, so that Catherine can bring to bear all of the resources that an insurance company can help all of these smaller businesses who may not have the resources of the Fortune 500.
And Justin, I used to call that the feathering act, and shows my age a little bit. It's an old Vegas show where there's a series of feathers in front of the dancer, and they remove it and they never see anything because the feathers are right behind it. And it's the same thing. We want where one insurance policy ends, the other to pick up. And while we play nice with other insurance, when there is that duplication, right? We have more insurance than needed. We work together, and we do that all the time. But you want to know that if I'm covering this, and this goes to what Jodi was talking before about knowing your inventory, knowing what you have and where you keep it. Because if you don't know all of those things, when you think, oh, I don't need funds transfer fraud, or I don't need regulatory, or right, you're trying to carve out to save some money. If you don't know what you have, then you don't know what to get. And so you need to be and work with your broker, work with the insurance carriers to say, is this covered? Is this, and that comes through your tabletops, right? Practicing of saying, hey, let's try this event. Or what if this changes the facts? Would cover still exist? Because not all insurance is created equal, and BOP, right? Your BOP or just your crime isn't going to cover a lot of these events that we've been talking about.
And I'd add one more thing. I'm sorry, Marc. I wanted to say
go ahead, Justin.
That I think is really relevant is I've seen two different kinds of policies I've dealt with recently. One had a $10,000 deductible. The other one had a $100,000 deductible. And I think it's important that you need to really think long and hard about how much you're really going to save if you get a lower premium to have a $100,000 deductible. Because when you have to hire forensic, legal, you're going to run through that $100,000 pretty quickly. And whatever cost savings you have is just out the window. So I would just say, think really carefully when you want to get a deductible that's that high.
Justin, are you saying you're very expensive or? Sure. I want to add to the conversation with regards to what law enforcement can contribute to small, medium-sized businesses, because I think it's a great question to ask. And personally, I love engaging with those kind of people and organizations, because they don't, like several folks just mentioned here, they don't have the resources often to do the things that larger organizations do, to include educating employees on cyber hygiene and whatnot. So, of course, there's a lot of small, medium businesses in every jurisdiction, and we can't do every one individually. What I encourage folks to do is to be part of like your local chamber of commerce. And I've done several speeches to chambers of commerces and other organizations, associations of realtor associations that maybe are engaged in, real estate transactions where we see a lot of fraud there. So speaking to large groups is really more effective for us. I mean, we certainly do one-offs on occasion, but when we do talk to folks, we help them try to frame cyber. I love to use protection analogies. In Secret Service, most folks probably on this call here would only know us for our protective world, but we work in this circle of protection where we have an outer, inner, and middle perimeter, and it's really same in cyber world too. And we talk about framing all this in the context of people, processes, and technology, right? And so when we talk about training people, I mean, that's the critical part. I mean, you're only as secure as that 18-year-old intern that's at the keyboard over the summer, clicking away, and not trained on phishing emails. So we love to engage in that and be a part of that. And it kind of circles back around to my original point is, establish that relationship early. And so you can be offered those things.
Hey, Catherine, a question came in here about the Zurich versus Mondelez court case that's going on. Just real recap. That was a company that was hit by the NotPetya ransomware attack. And there's a lot of attribution about that being, tracked back to Russia, and that it was actually part of the aggression in the Crimea and the Ukraine. And at that point, Zurich, who was the carrier, refused to pay for ransoms and damages, citing active war. So you're in that industry. What's your opinion on that? Where you think this is going?
Well, there's been case law, and I'm going to call on Justin to help a little bit as well on this, but there's been clear case law about the war aspect. And it needs to be a declaration of war. This actually goes all the way back to 9/11, when this was first, the whole declaration of war was necessary versus terrorism. And so now the cyber carriers, ourselves included, when it's, an act of this cyber act, it is not an act of war. This is more, just the ransomware, et cetera. The other part, though, with Zurich and Mondelez also had with the type of policy it was and the various wording. So it's much more in depth than just war. But really, for cyber policies, it doesn't come into play, and it needs to be a declaration by a country. I don't know if Justin wants to add anything there.
I think what I will add to that is when I review a cybersecurity insurance policy, it is one of the most challenging contracts to review. It's very dense. There's a lot in there. I think the lesson to be learned when we talk about the Zurich case is that is in the context of hundreds of millions of dollars of payments that have to be made. And there are companies that will take positions because they're looking at what the potential outlay is. And I think you really need to think about that case in a wider context of ransomware has gone through the roof. The insurance carriers have been hit with all kinds of claims. And I have had several clients who re-up their insurance after having a cyber claim, and their rates are going up by 40%. So when I think about the Zurich case, I guess I'm looking at the wider perspective of if you are relying on your insurance as a tool, which you should, but not a panacea, you have to expect that the ransomware coverage is going to change dramatically because of the avalanche of claims that have gone on last year and the beginning of this year.
And it may change. It's not changing on our side for Coalition. But the fact is that knowing, to your point, having that stronger security, shoring up your systems, right? Insurance is not a pan, it doesn't fix all, right? And there's many times where things that you're like, oh, well, gosh, we incurred this too. We don't fix everything. So the way to fix everything is to prevent it from happening. And that's one of the things that you can also do in working with outside entities, working with carriers that are kind of these insurtech, right? Just as like Coalition, where we scan the universe and treat you as if we are the hacker and tell you where your weaknesses are so that you can shore up your system as well. It's not a fix-all, but our purpose is to ensure insurance insures. Like that's what we're doing. We're making sure insurance works.
So Catherine, I want to make sure that everybody has a chance for some final thoughts because we have about 5 minutes left on the docket today. So real quick, AXA pulled ransomware payment coverage in France. Crystal ball, do you see this spreading or where do you think that's going to go?
I don't see it spreading. I see some carriers that perhaps didn't underwrite as well, changing their position. Those that are confident in their underwriting, staying the course. This isn't something that's going anywhere. To what Marc had said before, we're not going to make a victim of the victim. We're here to make sure that insurance works and to solve cyber risk ultimately.
Fantastic. So we've got about 4 minutes left. So we have our next steps here. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. So engage the C-suite, right? As we talked about earlier, make sure that it isn't just technical solutions and programs that you're looking at, but the business ones, because there are often business decisions that come out of this. We're going to, disable remote access, and the next thing you know, you realize that's going to make this event public. So maybe that's not something you want your IT department. Obviously, consult, connect, and work proactively with law enforcement and your insurer, right? Get them involved, know who to call, know Marc by name and know his phone number rather than calling 1-800 I'm in trouble. Over the next 3 months, build out your response plan, develop your team, test them, make sure, as Jodi's talked about, you understand your obligations, you understand the assets, they're classified, you know where they are, where they move, and so on, so that you can deal with that. If something occurs, you know what your obligations are. And then over the 6 months, this is the long slog, right? This is the building out your risk registry, running risk assessments, prioritizing, conducting simulations, working tabletops. And again, I can't say it enough, right? Engage with law enforcement. So we've got 3 minutes left. So let's go super quick here. So for final thoughts, I'm going to start at the far end of the panel here. So Catherine, go.
Make sure you have insurance, know what your insurance covers, and make sure that you can rely on those panelists to reach out to people like Marc and Justin and Jodi.
Fantastic. Jodi.
Definitely know your data. I'm going to also add about training your employees. There's some very basics, blocking and tackling that our employees can do. So if you don't already have, make sure that you look into some basic privacy and security training. Fantastic. Marc.
You don't have to look far in the newspapers to see that these issues are front and center. And without phone calls from victims, there's no attribution. I mean, we need to know about it. So we encourage you, if you haven't caught the message yet, is to establish those relationships with law enforcement early on the front end before these incidents happen. Secretservice.gov is going to be your website for us, where we have on our investigations tab a link to all our cyber task forces. We have a link to IC3 and all these other things as well. So please engage with us early and often. Thank you.
Fantastic. Final word, Justin.
I'm going to leave with a thought for the audience, and that's this. How do we make cybersecurity the digital seatbelt of the 21st century? We get in a car nowadays, we don't even think twice, and we engage our seatbelt. But that wasn't always the case. And I think cybersecurity is the same way. And we need to educate. We may have to pass laws. And one of the key things is, how do we rethink how the public and private sector collaborate? And today is a great example of that. How can we better rethink how to proactively collaborate with law enforcement?
Terrific. Thank you, Justin. So again, to all the panelists, to Justin, to Marc, Jodi, and Catherine, thank you very much for your time today, for sharing your experiences, your observations, and your recommendations. And thanks to you two, the attendees who have joined us for this session. So I'll just leave you with a few things here. We do We highly encourage you to fill out the session feedback form. We'd love to hear from you. And also, if you'd like a copy of this presentation, it is available now in the virtual environment from the session description page, as is an accompanying white paper that we authored that goes into all of these topics and in more of a sort of a prescriptive detail to kind of help you at least start as a bit of a framework. So I wouldn't quite say it's comprehensive, but at the same time, it's a good start, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. And if nothing else, it's a conversation piece that you can take back to your boards after having attended this session, realizing that these issues are far more complex than they look on the surface. So again, thanks very much to our panelists. Thank you, attendees. This concludes the session.